In many of the next videos that will be uploaded to this channel, we're going to take a look at a lot of Ethiopian military history, ranging from 1876 to 1896, observing the changes that took place in Ethiopian combat from the Egyptian-Ethiopian War to the Italo-Ethiopian War. Needless to say, there are quite a bit of them, emblematic of worldwide changes in the shift from medieval to modern combat. To fully appreciate this, I thought it would be fitting to create a video that discusses the general state of Ethiopian armies in 1875, before the Egyptian-Ethiopian War. During most of the 19th century, Ethiopian armies primarily relied on traditional weapons for combat: swords, spears, and shields, the use of which was often taught to children from a young age. Among the most well-known Ethiopian swords was the shotel, a sword with a curved blade. These blades had two main variants: a very curved variant whose purpose was to strike around or over shields, puncturing opponents with the tip, and a more straight variant, less specialized in puncturing with the tip, and more versatile, capable of also performing stabs. Of course, in reality, this categorization was a bit more fluid, but these patterns generally persist. Along with swords came spears, which were used especially commonly by the Oromo people and their notorious cavalry, but were also used by other Ethiopian warriors and soldiers across the country. Spears were often about 6 feet long and could be used for both thrusting and throwing, though they more frequently saw the former use. Of course, no man's melee kit would be complete without the shield, and Ethiopians had some of the most elegant shields around. Styles of shield varied between ethnicity and between region, but generally, shields were circular and made of hide. They would be covered with colored cloth such as velvet, and strengthened with strips of metal such as brass or tin. In this way, a shield was also used to show off one's wealth and status, and richer warriors and nobility would often find themselves using shields plated with more metal when compared to their poorer counterparts. While Ethiopians had been using swords, spears, and shields for centuries, it was only in the 19th century that guns and artillery came into widespread use, and these weapons saw and caused some of the most extreme changes to Ethiopian combat in history. For the most part, Ethiopian forces consistently used artillery poorly. The British, Egyptians, and even other Ethiopians would remark on how little physical impact they made, but this wasn't too much of a problem in inter-Ethiopian warfare, where artillery often obtained a high shock value, making up for its incapability to deal physical harm. The loud noises that artillery made often scared less seasoned troops and horses, who were not often exposed to the loud bangs of cannon fire, hurting morale and potentially causing them to rout. Prior to Yohannes' campaigns against the Egyptians, the vast majority of Ethiopian artillery were cannon, and guns were relatively low quality and outdated British or French smoothbore and rifled muskets obtained through trade from key ports, such as at Massawa. In further inland regions, it wasn't uncommon to see men still using flintlocks, which, for a point of reference, were largely replaced in Europe by the mid-19th century. This use of dated arms was probably caused mostly by the lack of high supply from foreign traders, and while attempts were made to remedy this issue by Emperor Tewodros, it wouldn't be until the Ethiopian victories at Gura and Gundet that an Ethiopian army would get their hands on modern guns en masse. At Gura, out of 50,000 Ethiopians, only about 10,000 would have guns of any kind, nearly all of which were dated, and, due to issues in obtaining ammunition, poorly made bullets and stones were often used instead, both of whom could sometimes be absorbed by a shield. Aside from locally manufactured bullets and gunpowder, Ethiopia's arms manufacture was not an industry, and while attempts to produce modern weaponry internally were made by previous emperors such as Tewodros, who had smiths manufacture cannons and attempted to forge guns, these didn't really catch on. Except for the lucky Ethiopians who managed to get their hands on more up-to-date Snyders and Remington rifles, The guns that Ethiopians wielded were generally relatively old and relatively weak, especially when compared with the weaponry being used elsewhere in the world. In inter-Ethiopian combat, cavalry very frequently beat back gunmen, despite often themselves wielding spears and swords, and the Ethiopian combat of the mid-19th century was in some ways a competition between the horse and the gun. Often the horse would win, even as late as 1884, when, in the Battle of Ibabo, Menelik's cavalry defeated the gunmen of Tekle Haimanot. But with increasingly high-quality guns becoming available towards the end of the century, and Ethiopians utilizing artillery to greater and greater effect, the gun would grow in importance. One early example of this was the battle near the Assam River between the future Emperor Johannes, named Kasa at the time, and the then Emperor Tekle Georgis. While the guns used by Johannes in this battle were relatively low quality, Johannes did have about 852 good quality, albeit dated guns, and a massive supply of ammunition both given to him by the British, all of which were used effectively in battle, where Tekle Georgis's far numerically superior army was defeated by an army about 1/6 the size due to heavy fire from hill positions, which ruined attempted cavalry charges. Ethiopian armies had multiple different categorizations, the most important being Asiralaka, which translates to corporal and who were commanders of 10 men, Mateolaka, which translates to lieutenant and who commanded 100 men, Shalaka, translating to major and who were commanders of 1,000 men, and the Gazmach, which, in a military context, is equivalent to a lieutenant general. These men were typically subordinate to their Ras, generals and high-ranking feudal rulers, who were in turn often subordinate to Nagusas, and who, finally, were subordinate to the Nagus Nagast, king of kings, or emperor, who held power over all. The months when a campaign could be launched were limited, and thus taken into extreme consideration. Campaigning during the rainy season was hellish, so the time period between June and September was often off limits for military campaigns, leaving the months of September and onwards. When a military campaign finally took place, recruiting men could also be a challenge. While Ethiopian commanders often had their own personal armies, they were usually relatively small for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was funding, and, as a result, most of the men recruited in a campaign joined voluntarily, either because they thought that the campaign was just and wanted to help the cause, out of loyalty for their feudal leader, or because of the hope of reaping good benefits from a successful war, such as the capture of weapons, cattle, horses, and other goods. Since participation was largely voluntary, this meant that morale was an even larger factor in battle than it might be in more professionalized armies, and big hits to it could easily result in the complete dissolution of the majority of an army. An Ethiopian campaign would begin with a military leader gathering his men up in what is known as a kitet. District and province leaders would rally men to fight for them by playing loud war drums, especially useful to alert those away in the countryside. These drums backed up his stands to make proclamations of war in big marketplaces, towns, cities, and other miscellaneous common gathering spots. When a call to arms was being issued in such a way, the announcer would often have a servant or slave next to him holding his lance and robe, hoping to confirm his rank. In W. W. Loring's account of the Egyptian-Ethiopian War, he remarks that J.C. Kirkham, a British diplomat and military advisor under Johannes, had warned the Egyptian army that Johannes could marshal about 60,000 men in 40 to 50 days, and though this estimate probably fails to take into account the potential additional military capability of Shawa, one of Ethiopia's major kingdoms, it does give a decent benchmark nonetheless. After gathering at a meeting place, often Adwa for Johannes, the Ethiopian army would go on the march. Many sources, both contemporary and modern, compare this on-the-march army to a migration or caravan, but however disorganized an army got on the march, they always managed to regroup at camp, where important figures were surrounded by their respective followers. The wives and children of a soldier or warrior might have joined them on the march, and, as a result, Ethiopian army sizes were sometimes found to be only about half of what reports claimed they were, which sometimes estimated the amount of camp followers, and not the amount of actual fighting men. The wives and children would help a warrior or soldier with tasks such as obtaining and preparing food and obtaining water. As the last sentence implied, the Ethiopian army often lived off whatever food a warrior or their wife brought along with themselves, and if they ran off, then off the land, which meant that campaigns had to be short or at least highly mobile. Prolonged sieges were, as a result of this, virtually impossible, and campaigns would often result in local peasantry and farmers being pillaged of their food, both crops and sometimes cattle. During the Zemene Mesafint, this caused nearly all of the provinces and kingdoms of Ethiopia, excluding Shawa, who endured far less warring on home turf, to struggle greatly with their agricultural output. Excluding artillery fire, the vast majority of Ethiopian fighting was close-ranged. This was, of course, mainly caused by the major use of traditional weapons, such as spears, shields, and swords, but also due to the fact that even Ethiopian guns were relatively low quality, and ammunitions were often hard to come by. This required their users to be relatively close to their targets before shooting them, both to ensure a hit, and to ensure that that hit would actually be deadly. The general plan for any Ethiopian army was envelopment. Engulf your enemy with your men, leaving them no means of escape to defeat them as efficiently as possible. And to do this, crescent or half-moon formations were often employed. Due to Ethiopia's notoriously poor terrain, said formations could be a pain, often impossible to assemble, and a myriad of other tactics were used instead to achieve the same goals. The Ethiopian army is noted as having fought in many different styles, but the most common formation was reminiscent of a phalanx. Men were tightly packed together, which, given that Ethiopian armies had and continued to fight primarily with swords and spears, was an advantageous method of warfare for the situation that 19th century Ethiopia found itself in. However, the use of phalanx-like formations against modern weapons would prove to be increasingly costly to Ethiopian troops, who increasingly found that, at battles such as Gura, where Egyptian artillery is said to have cut down dozens of men at once, phalanx formations were simply no longer sustainable in modern combat against foes with up-to-date technology. The transition from phalanx to looser formations when fighting armies with modern weapons would take some time, but by the time of the Italo-Ethiopian War, it was near to complete.